All right. Well, welcome to a kind of a miserable day, but that's all right. We're inside. That's what matters, isn't it? So today we'll be looking at the second half of chapter 10, where we're looking at the so-called loanable funds market. What we're going to do here is explain where interest rates come from, or at least develop a model that attempts to explain where interest rates come from. And you'll see as we're going along, it is very closely related to the traditional supply and demand framework that we've been working with all this time. And that's no accident. We do a lot of analysis in economics with supply and demand or similar concepts. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to imagine that in the market, there are people who are saving money and who are willing to lend it out to others in order to earn interest. There are other people who want to borrow money. Okay. And that would be, let's say people want to buy a house or they want to buy a car. Now, it wouldn't be possible for the borrowers to borrow money unless they're the savers who had money to lend. All right. So, in other words, if nobody put their money in the bank, then nobody could borrow any money either. So there have to be people who are making funds available to this market, the savers, and there are therefore also going to be borrowers. And without the borrowers, the lenders couldn't earn any interest. So the two sides really need each other. And so what we're going to do is see how the interaction between borrowing and lending is what ultimately determines the level of interest rates in the economy. Um, Given the level, given what's going on in the economy, of course, and what's going on with the Federal Reserve System, but the rates at which you actually borrow and lend are largely determined by the interaction of borrowers and lenders. All right, so that's what this chapter is really all about. So we're going to assume that loans are intended for three purposes. We have business investment, we have governments borrowing to cover their deficits. We have investment coming from international sectors, but also we do have private loans as well for, let's say, like I said, individuals borrowing to buy cars or to buy houses. But a lot of the activity comes from either the business sector and governments. The amount of lending to consumers is not as large, although it is part of this. But now, where does this saving come from? The funds, and oh, by the way, we're using the term loanable funds in this chapter. These are funds that have been made available to the market by savers and now are available to lend out to borrowers. So we call them loanable funds. All right, that's going to be the name. Now, if you've never heard that phrase before, it simply means funds that are specifically intended for either borrowing or lending purposes. All right, now, let's see. So as far as the funds, the suppliers of these funds are private individuals, okay, you and I, any government surpluses that may take place, which is rare, by the way, and we can also borrow from foreigners, okay? And in fact, we do tend to borrow a lot of money from foreigners. In fact, every time we have a trade deficit, we're in effect borrowing from foreigners because they're essentially financing our purchases. So a lot of our loanable funds comes from private sources, from any government surpluses that might pop up once in a while. And a lot of it also comes from the international sector. And plus, now corporations also can provide their own funds. Corporations during a given year will obviously earn a lot of revenues. They will also pay out a lot of expenses. When the year is over, if there's anything left over after all the expenses are paid, those are referred to as earnings, or sometimes they're called, it's called net income. So a corporation, in fact, let me add the separate slide for this. So for a corporation, revenues minus expenses equals net income or earnings. Okay, they both mean the same thing. A corporation may pay some of its earnings to investors in the form of dividends. The rest can be saved for future investments in the company or possibly to pay expenses. In other words, when a corporation decides, let's say, to expand into a new market, let's say that Starbucks decides, you know what, why don't we have any stores in Australia? Well, let's say they don't. Why don't we start having stores in Australia? Well, they have to raise a lot of money to do that. So what they can do is they can either issue bonds, as we've seen, they can issue stocks, or they can use their own earnings from past years, which if they've been saving these earnings, they could use those as well. Now, the savings of the corporation or earnings that have not been paid out as dividends are known as retained earnings. Okay, it simply means earnings that they have saved from the past. So every year that they do not pay out all their earnings as dividends, they will add these to their existing retained earnings. So it's a type of savings for the corporation. And they can then use that money for anything they choose as an alternative to issuing more bonds and stocks. All right, just like an individual, like if you go to buy a car, you can certainly get a loan from the bank. But I mean, if you have enough money in the bank, you can use that money to buy the car too. A lot of people would rather not do that because even though they're paying interest on a loan, your savings basically form a type of safety net. They can be used for emergency expenses or for things that you might want to buy. And so if you, let's say you spend all of your lifetime savings to buy a new car, what happens if you have an emergency now and you need some of that money? Well, it's not there. So a lot of people would borrow, even if it's not absolutely necessary. And the same thing is true of a corporation. They may decide to issue bonds and stocks, even if they have some retained earnings that they could use. The retained earnings can then be used for emergency purposes or for maybe taking advantages of opportunities that come along that they weren't expecting. So a corporation has a type of savings, which is known as retained earnings. These are also part of the market for loanable funds because the corporation in principle can lend these out. So anyway, so the demand for loanable funds, which is the borrow, oh, Fernando, yes.
I just have a quick question. Why is it always called like gross income and net income? Like what did that originated from and why was it always called that way? If it's like earnings pretty much.
Oh, it depends. See, gross income. All right, let me just. This is a little detour here. This is interesting. This will only take a minute to explain. Let's go through this example. Suppose that Starbucks earns during a given year, I don't know, $10 billion in revenues. Okay, the cost of making coffee, meaning coffee beans, milk, sugar, etc., is 2 billion, and all other expenses are, let's say, 4 billion. Now that would be other related items. Now that would be things like property taxes, manager salaries, expenses that we must pay, but are not directly related to the making of the coffee. So the way it works is this: the $2 billion used to actually make the coffee is known as cost of goods sold. Okay, so revenues minus cost of goods sold equals gross income. Gross income minus all other expenses equals net income. Okay, so net income is what's left over at the end of the year. This is what actually is available to be paid out as dividends to the stockholders or else held onto as retained earnings. It's the equivalent of when you get a paycheck, and if you've ever worked, even just part-time for a few hours, you know that the amount of money that you're being paid is not what actually goes into your pockets. There's a lot of deductions, as you know, for all these different kinds of taxes, and there's Social Security, and then there's Medicare, and there's all this and that. So the money that's on your check the money that goes into your pocket is your net income or your net pay. The gross pay is how much the employer actually paid you before all the other items were taken out. So this is a similar idea. And so the corporation at the end of the year has net income that they potentially could spend on dividends, or they could save it. And in the case of Starbucks, maybe use it next year to open up a new store, or maybe buy more efficient coffee grinders, all kinds of possibilities. But their net earnings, net income at the end of the year that is not being paid out as dividends, they could in principle go out into the market and buy stocks or bonds from other corporations if they chose to do so. So that makes it part of the loanable funds market, because some of the money they've earned is available to be lent out to somebody else. All right, did that answer your question?
Yeah, but
Okay, good.
was it always just there though? Just the name of net and gross. That's just also I was curious about.
Yeah, net usually means the absolute bottom line after everything is taken into account. Gross just means you're deducting certain types of expenses. The reason why it's done this way is for accounting purposes. It has to do with tax laws. Certain expenses are tax deductible and certain ones are not. And so it has to be organized a certain way. And so this is what's typically done, at least in the United States. So if you're, starting to become interested in investing in stocks, what you can actually do is go to a website like finance.yahoo.com, and you can actually look up these numbers. In fact, let me just quickly, as long as we're on the subject, let's come here and go to Starbucks, which I think is SBUK. No, how about SBK? Oh, SBUX. Okay. So there they are. And here's where you can find that information, financials. So you go to look at their income statement, which is where all of this is calculated, and you're going to see. So last year, their revenues were, $29 billion. Not bad. The cost of revenue, this is what I was referring to, the cost of making the coffee is about $20.669 billion. So the gross profit is roughly $8.4 billion. Then we take away all these other expenses, the ones that do not relate to the making of the coffee. Like I said, salaries and, electricity and, all kinds of expenses that the corporation runs into. And when all of that is deducted, they ended up with, oh God, where is it? Well, this is very strangely set up. I can't believe it. They did not at any point in this column calculate the net income. This is very strangely set up. Normally what would happen is after subtracting the operating or the other income or expenses rather, somewhere in the bottom here, there'd be a line that says net income. And oh my God, these people, it's not there. They couldn't, it's like oh my God. Well, all right, go to another source, but that's normally how it's set up. Total revenue minus the cost of goods sold, or the cost of revenue, is gross profit. After deducting all the rest, you have net profit or net income. And in spite of this very terrible setup, I still, you know what? I think I know what the problem is. The way they've written it, I didn't recognize it. It's right here. Net income from continuing, right here. Okay, it is about $4 billion. That's one of the tricky things about these financial statements. A lot of them may have similar names for the same thing. You have to watch out for that. So I actually didn't realize that what this was supposed to be. So once again, it's about 29 billion for revenues, about 20 billion for cost of goods sold, gross profit about 8.4 billion, and then the net profit or net income is about 4.2 billion. And that's the money that they could potentially pay out as dividends. And they probably will pay some dividends, but not much. And the rest will go back into their own pockets to be reinvested in their future operations. Okay. And that's, oh, yeah, go ahead, Fernando.
Yeah, I just have one last quick question to ask. When learning like finances, would whoever takes finances will also learn about like the gross income, the taxes, and all that stuff, like a
Oh,
little bit.
sure. Absolutely. Yeah. If any typical corporate finance course will
Okay.
explain all of this stuff to you in great. I don't unfortunately think that they offer that here. That would require you to be at a school that has a finance major. Yeah, I mean, obviously the school doesn't have a business school. That's one thing they don't have. And so if you want that, you'll have to go elsewhere. But what you could do is get an MBA when you're done here, and then you'll study all this stuff in very great detail. And the great thing about MBA programs is that you don't have to have any particular major to get into one. But once you're there, you're going to be hit with very intensive study of finance and accounting and management and marketing and all the rest. And then when you're done, you'll have a piece of paper that says, I'm qualified to be a manager of some kind. And therefore, I expect to be paid a lot of money. So, yeah, that's still out there if you want it, but unfortunately not here. All right. Well, anyway, so let's get back to this now. So what we're saying here is that this revenue in principle, because sometimes what a corporation will do is if they have a lot of retained earnings and they don't really need it for any particular purpose, they will go out and buy stocks and bonds from other corporations just to make a little extra revenue on the side. So that goes into the pile of loanable funds that are available to be lent out. So we're going to assume we're going to start by looking at the perspective of the borrowers. These are said to be the people who demand loanable funds. Okay, so if you want to borrow, you're said to have a demand for loanable funds. And so what we're really using them here for is primarily for business investment, government deficits, or international investment. Okay, with some consumer lending as well. But we're going to assume that the demand for loanable funds is really based on two things: the real rate of interest and expected profits. Now, by the way, just as a quick reminder, anytime you see the word real in economics, it means adjusted for inflation. And this is no exception. We're going to define the real rate of interest as the nominal rate, the rate you actually see in the marketplace, minus the rate of inflation. And the real rate is basically telling you how much the lender is earning in terms of purchasing power. So in other words, if I lend you, let me just make up a quick example here. If a bank makes a car loan for 8%, while the inflation rate is 2%, the bank's real rate of return in terms of purchasing power is 6%. Therefore, in this case, the real rate of interest is 6%. So this is what we're assuming that the banks are focusing on when they decide to make a loan. They're thinking in terms of what would be my real rate of interest or my real rate of return, because really the bottom line ultimately is how much does this increase my purchasing power? And of course, keep in mind too, lenders are taking a risk and they expect to be compensated for that risk. And of course they should be, because they're providing you with a service. I mean, when you go to the car dealer, and say, listen, I want to buy a car, almost all car dealers, probably all of them, have their own financing division. And they'll say, listen, don't go to a bank. We'll finance it for you. And they're making things easy for you. They're saying, don't worry, just sign right here. And you can just pay us a monthly amount every month and you can have that car. Okay. And so otherwise you'd have to go to a bank, and that makes it less likely that you'll buy the car. And it also means that they have less profits, because I'm sure they're making some money off of those loans. Although most of their profits do come from the cars themselves, still, this is a good way for them to make a little extra money and make it easier for you to sign on the dotted line. All right, so we're going to assume, though, that the demand and the supply really for loanable funds are going to come down to what real rate of interest can be expected to be earned or paid if you're the borrower. And number two, expected profits. Businesses will borrow money in the marketplace, typically by issuing bonds or stocks, but not if things aren't going so well. Like right about now, the economy is kind of sluggish. This is not the ideal time to be starting up a new business or to expand your existing business. So a lot of companies will sit on their hands and say, listen, we'll just wait till things turn around before we start expanding again. So, when the economy is not doing so well, that's when the demand for loanable funds will be weaker than when the economy is really booming, when everybody wants to expand their business or start a new business. So, the state of the economy is a huge determinant of the demand for loanable funds. And the same thing holds for individuals. If you're worried about losing your job, that is not the time to go buy a new car or buy a new house. So, the state of the economy has a huge impact on all of this as reflected by expected profits. Okay, so now on the other hand, governments who are borrowing to cover their deficits, they have to pay their bills. They'll borrow no matter what is going on in the economy. So from their perspective, the only factor that determines how much they want to borrow is how much or how big are their deficits. So what we're seeing here only refers to the private sector, corporations, um, individuals, and possibly foreign corporations. The rest of the borrowing is mandatory for the governments that have deficits. So they can't just say, well, the economy's not doing so well, maybe we shouldn't borrow so much. No, they have to cover their debts. They have to pay their bills. So, but in the private sector, these are the two main determinants of the demand for loanable funds. All right, now we're going to draw a curve for this. Of course we are. You had to expect that. In economics, everything can be done with graphs. Okay, now let's see what it looks like. Now, here's what we have. We have a real rate of interest on the vertical axis and the quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis. DLF is a fancy abbreviation for the demand for loanable funds. And you can see it has its familiar downward shape, downward slope. Now, by the way, I just want to point out that with a traditional supply and demand curve, with the demand curve, you've got the price in the vertical axis. So here, we can think of the real rate of interest as the price of borrowing money. So even though it's a rate of interest, it still could be thought of as a price. Okay, how expensive is it to borrow? That depends on the real rate of interest. On the horizontal axis, it says loanable funds. We can think of that as the quantity of funds that people are willing to borrow. So that is a quantity. So that means that this is just like any other demand curve you've ever seen, except that it specifically refers to loanable funds rather than a physical good or service. And you can understand, I'm sure you can understand why it's downward sloping. When the real rate is very high, people will not borrow as much. Like if you're thinking about buying a new car and you see that interest rates are very high, you might decide to wait a little longer. Or if you're thinking about buying a new house, well, with a house, the interest rate has a huge impact on the monthly payments. So if rates are very high, you might decide, well, maybe I'll hang on to my apartment a little longer and I'll wait for rates to drop a little further. But when the rates do drop, then you might run out and immediately buy a new house, the house you always wanted. Or if you need a car, you go out and buy it when rates are lower because it'll be that much cheaper to finance it. All right. Now, I just want to remind you that if the real rate changes, we'll move up and down the same curve. And we call that a change in the quantity demanded of loanable funds. Okay, so this again is just like what we saw with our traditional supply and demand curves, moving up and down the same curve due to a change in the price, or in this case, the real rate, is called a change in the quantity demanded. You also might recall that if something else changes besides what's on the vertical axis, the entire curve will shift. All right, now we're going to see that next, but there's a few different things that can cause that to happen. So just remember, here, all the change was a real rate, and so we moved up and down the same curve. and that is known as a change in quantity demanded. To get the curve shifted, something else has to change. So what could cause that to happen? All right, well, we've already decided that the main factors are the main other factor. Sorry, remember, we only defined two factors that determine the demand for loanable funds. The real rate, which is on the vertical axis, the external factor, which is not on that axis, is expected profits, which you could think of that as sort of a, I would say a proxy or substitute for the state of the economy, because when the economy is doing well, expected profits will be high. When the economy is not doing so well, expected profits will fall. So expected profits can include a lot of information. But the bottom line is businesses are not going to want to borrow unless they're pretty confident that they're going to use that money to make profits. Okay, so Starbucks, in order for them to buy, let's say, more updated blenders, they're not going to bother unless they think it's going to increase their profits by selling more smoothies every hour or whatever it is they sell. I don't remember what kind of frozen drinks they have. It's been so long since I went in one of those places. During the COVID, we got used to not going places, and now we're just slowly coming back to normal. But I haven't been in a Starbucks in ages. I know they have frozen drinks. I just don't remember what they have. Whatever they are, if Starbucks really believes that having more efficient blenders would increase their sales, then they'll go ahead and actually invest in them. Otherwise, they won't bother. Now, if businesses become very optimistic about the state of the economy and their profits, then they will decide that it makes sense to borrow more at every level of interest. So in other words, the entire curve shifts to the right when expected profits go up. Of course, on the other hand, if things are looking bad and expected profits are dropping, then the demand curve would shift to the left. And so both of these are collectively known as a change in demand for loanable funds. All right, so just a quick recap. Moving up and down the same curve is a change in quantity demanded. Moving the entire curve is a change in demand. And we're going to assume in this model that the primary driver of this is expected profits in the economy, because this is coming from the private sector and their goal is to make money. The government, like I said, borrows money only when they have deficits. And so that will not be affected by expected profits. All right. So if we have a demand curve for loanable funds, what else must we have? How about a supply of loanable funds? Yes, we have to have a supply curve. Now, remember, the borrowers, or the demanders of loanable funds are borrowers. The suppliers are lenders or savers. So what causes people to want to save? What is really the main motivation for saving? Well, you want to have money around for emergencies, of course. You never know when a tree is going to fall on your car or something, or all of a sudden there's some disaster with your house. Things break down a lot, especially if you live in a house. You're constantly facing repairs. If you have an older car, you're constantly needing to get it fixed. You never know what might happen. So it provides a type of safety net, but also we need to earn a positive rate of return. Fernando?
To your question earlier about like why do people save, was that like an actual question or was it
Sure,
like
go ahead. Do you have any thoughts about that?
yeah, I was thinking about like probably people would save for like maybe the reason of like having a house or getting a new car,
Mhm.
like having a retirement plan and all those benefits for them or
Oh,
any.
yes.
That's what I think.
Those are excellent examples because, it's hard to think about these things when you're still in college. But, when you start out, you get out there and start working, you begin to realize that, at some point down the road, you're going to need to retire. And so you want to save money for that, of course. But at some point, you also may think, I'm tired of this cramped apartment. I want a real house. And so to have a house, you can't typically borrow the full amount. You typically have to provide a down payment of some kind. And the down payment could be very, very expensive. Suppose you're trying to buy a house in Westchester and it's $500,000, and the bank insists on a down payment of 10%. That means you've got to hand over to them $50,000 just to buy that house. I mean, of course, you're going to be paying the mortgage with monthly installments, but 50 grand, that's a lot of money. So you better have it. Otherwise, you're not going to get that house. Not so much with cars. Cars, typically the down payment could be as little as $1,000 if it's a brand new car. That shouldn't be much of a problem. But so yes, all these big ticket items that you want, realistically, you have to save your money to buy them. And also, in order to retire properly and not have to wait till you're 98 years old, you need to start putting money away in investments like stocks and bonds. So the savings, and of course, like I said before, you always want to have money available for emergencies. You never know what could go wrong. Something always goes wrong. It's just a fact of life. And you never know when one day suddenly you realize, oh my God, my uh, dishwasher needs to be replaced, or my refrigerator is broken, or I had an accident with my car and I have to pay all this money to get it fixed, or something went wrong with the house. The roof needs to be fixed. So you never know. There's always all kinds of potential expenses coming your way. And that's what the savings are good for, to provide you with a safety net. Now, you can always borrow too, of course, but at some point, of course, you have to pay off all your debts. And so the more money you have saved up, the better off you'll be. Now, another way of thinking about it too is that when you decide how much of your money to save and how much to spend, if in periods of time when interest rates are unusually low, like now, you might find that savings is only giving you a very small rate of return, and you might be tempted to buy more things. But when interest rates go up, you might think, maybe if I could save some more of my money, I could earn a lot of interest in the bank. So the level of interest rates in the economy is going to have a major effect on your decision, how much to save and how much to spend. And the same thing with corporations, but as they decide what to do with their retained earnings. But so the supply curve is, as you probably can guess, going to be upward sloping. So again, imagine as an individual, you're constantly faced with decisions about saving versus spending. And so the higher the rate of interest you can get from your savings, the more likely you are to save and the less likely you are to spend on fun things. Certain things you have to have. I mean, obviously you have to pay your rent, you have to pay for food and groceries, there's a lot of expenses that you can't avoid, but there's hopefully going to be money at the end of the at the end of the week that you can spend on something fun if you choose to do so, or you can save it. And so, the higher the rate of return is, the more of an incentive you have to save rather than spend the money. And so the supply curve is upward sloping. All right. So, and that's just reality. I mean, if let's say, that the banks are paying very little interest right now, but what if you suddenly found that you can earn 10% by putting your money in the bank? I think you would find it well worth your while to really scrape together as much savings as you could find and keep it in the bank, because that's a really nice rate of return. But since the amount you're getting paid is so trivial, that's going to make it harder for you to justify saving when there's a lot of things that you really would like to have. So this is going to be an important determinant of that trade-off between spending and saving. And so once again, moving up and down this curve due to changes in the real rate, we'll call that now a change in the quantity supplied of loanable funds. So as we move from 1 to 2, for example, because rates went from 4 to 6%, more and more people are saving because they're getting a higher real rate of return. And that's called a change in the quantity supplied. Now, the factors that cause the curve to shift around would be other things besides the real rate of interest. So what could they be? All right, well, let's see. What kind of factors could cause the entire curve to shift? Let's find out. Ooh, this is a long list. Well, we know the real rate of interest. That's on the vertical axis, but disposable income. Suppose that you found yourself working at some job and suddenly you get a 25% raise. Are you going to spend every penny of that raise? Well, some people will, but I mean, for the most part, for the entire economy, a lot of people will save some of that increase in their income. So when incomes in general are rising, that means savings is going up. Okay. So as the economy as a whole becomes more affluent with higher incomes, there tends to be more savings. And then wealth. Imagine if all those stocks you bought suddenly tripled in value. You are now wealthier than you used to be, and chances are you'll find a way to save more of your money because you have so much wealth that you you can afford to save more. You can still have the things you want and yet still save more because you become wealthier. Here's an interesting one: expected future income. Suppose that you're pretty confident that you're going to get a raise in the future. It hasn't actually happened yet. You might be tempted to buy more, save more now, but also maybe buy more, just because you think your income will be higher in the future. So in other words, imagine if you're pretty sure that next year you'll have your income will be 20% higher. You might find yourself today setting aside more money because you expect to be able to buy more fun things with your future higher income. Now, default risk, this last one, this involves, basically in the economy as a whole, if the economy isn't doing well, default usually refers to a case where borrowers are unable to pay their debts. So if you're lending out money, now remember, the supply is coming from savers. When you lend out money, the biggest thing you worry about is not getting it back. So if default risk goes up, that's going to reduce the incentive to save. Okay, so, all right, anyway, we're going to go through these one at a time. So we'll start with the real rate of interest. And again, when this changes, since it's on the vertical axis, that means we're simply moving up and down the same supply curve. All right, let me just show you that again. We're moving up and down the same supply curve, which means we have a change in quantity supplied. Okay, so that one we know. Now, these others will cause the entire curve to shift. So the question is, which way? All right, now here we have disposable income. And by the way, the word disposable means after taxes. As this rises, people become more affluent and they will have the ability to save even more. And so the supply curve shifts to the right. But if the economy is in a slump and our disposable incomes are falling, the supply curve will shift to the left. Okay. So, like, just think of as an example. I mean, do you imagine that you'll be saving more money in 10 years than you are now? Of course, because your incomes will be a lot higher. Right now, as college students, your incomes are very small, possibly even zero. But in 10 years, when you're working at a big time financial job or whatever it is, you'll have a lot more money than you do now. And of course, you'll most likely be saving some of it. But again, there's always exceptions. There's always some people who can't save a nickel, no matter how much money they're making. But in general, for the entire population, savings will go up. You know who I'm talking about. Everybody, savings, the thing about savings is it requires a lot of self-discipline. And not everybody has self-discipline. As you know, some people just all they care about is the thrill of the moment, and they really and truly can't save. But then you get other people who are the other way around, who all they care about is how much money they have in the bank. Like you might recall a certain Mr. Scrooge, the only thing he ever cared about was how much money did he have in the bank. So because of that, he basically spent almost none of his income. He was very proud of it too. until, of course, at the end when he had his big transformation. And then all of a sudden, he couldn't give his money away fast enough. But yes, we have all kinds of people in the market. But in general, when incomes go up, you'd also expect to have more savings. Now, this next one, the book, I don't really agree with the book on this next one. They're trying to claim that when people are wealthier, they'll spend more and save less. Well, I think maybe what they mean here, and I don't know, the percentage that they save might go down. It depends. I don't know. This one seems a little backwards to me. They're trying to claim that higher wealth could actually reduce your savings. Fernando?
Wouldn't that like depend on your circumstances, like
Oh,
on
yes.
your financial circumstances to an individual who's wealthy?
Yes, it does. It depends. Like when they say wealth goes up, what if your wealth goes from 10, let's say you make 10 grand a year and you go to 20 or something, that's not going to have a huge impact on, because you still need to spend that money just to live. But if you went from like 10 million to 20 million, I don't know. It just seems to me like if you're Jeff Bezos, let's say your wealth goes from 50 billion to 100 billion. I can hardly imagine that you're going to spend that much. How much more money can you spend? I mean, really, there comes a point when you got everything you want. You know, what is there left to do except maybe buy his own country or something? I don't know. So I'm not happy with this one. Let's put it that way. This is what the book claims. And I don't know. It just seems backwards to me, but that's what the book says. I mean, if you inherited $1 million tomorrow, wouldn't you save more money than you do now? Of course you would. So that's why I'm not so sure about this one. But anyway, expected future income. Now, sometimes people base their behavior on what they expect to happen in the future. If they are doing well in their company and they expect that to continue in the future, they expect to get raises and promotions, that makes it easier to buy cars and, et cetera, et cetera. And so if they buy more things before their incomes go up, this is the trick. If they do start spending more now before their incomes go up, their savings can actually go down. But that depends again on the individual. A lot of people will simply wait until they've actually got that higher income in their hands. But there are many people who might just say, I'm going to have a big fat raise next year. Maybe now's the time to buy that new car, or maybe now's the time to buy a house. So, according to the book, on balance, higher expected future income means less saving because people are tempted to buy more things even before their incomes go up. I guess that's possible. These are kind of some gray areas, I think, compared to this one for sure. When incomes go up, people save more. There's no question about that one. Default risk, like I was starting to say before, default is the possibility that a borrower will not be able to repay the funds that they borrowed on time, which means that the risk is going to the lender or the saver. So if the default risk goes up, like the economy is in trouble, people are less likely to save and make their funds available to borrowers. So that would tend to cause the curve to shift to the left. Banks in particular will cut back on their lending dramatically when the economy is in rough shape because they're worried that people will not be able to pay their loans back. So this one, default risk going up means the economy is not doing well, and the supply of loanable funds would tend to go down or shift to the left. Yeah, this is never a good thing. Default risk, that's going up. That means the economy is in trouble. All right, well, let's bring these together. And you probably guessed a long time ago that we're going to define equilibrium in the loanable funds market, which simply means supply and demand are equal to each other. All right, this is equilibrium. So I put stars there to indicate their equilibrium values. E means equilibrium. And none of this is any different than what we've seen before. with our traditional supply and demand curves. Now, as you know, in a market, the market isn't necessarily always in equilibrium. What happens when it's not? Well, we've already seen this before, but let's see how that would work with the loanable funds market. What if for some reason rates are higher than the equilibrium level? Well, that means there's a surplus in the sense that the people who would like to borrow money are not borrowing the entire amount that's being made available to them because the rate of interest is so high. So in other words, when the rate is this high, at least some people who might have bought a car will think otherwise. Some people who might have bought a house will think, maybe we shouldn't do this right now. Or a business that might have borrowed money to expand its operations will say, maybe we should wait. And so because it's a surplus, we already have seen before that the price of this good will drop, which means in this case, the real rate of interest will slowly decline until equilibrium has been reached. So again, this is exactly like what we've seen with our traditional supply and demand curves. And this happens all the time. I mean, rates can creep up, they can go down. What we do know about this market, like any other market, is that there's an automatic tendency to drift back towards equilibrium if for some reason we're not there right now. And so how does that happen? Here, the interest rate drops. And then the people who said, oh, I don't want to buy a car now will say, oh, wait a minute, I changed my mind. I want to buy that car. Okay. So and then at some point when we get to R star, then everybody's happy again because the amount that's being made available to borrow is how much the borrowers want to borrow. And of course, if the opposite happens, the rates drop below the equilibrium level, everybody will say, oh my God, look how low rates are. Maybe it's time to buy that new car or that new house, but there's not enough funds available to support that. So the rates have to go up. Okay, there's only so many funds available. And if suddenly the demand for borrowing surges, there's going to be a shortage until rates start to go back up again. Okay, the banks will say, wait a minute, everybody is coming in here to borrow money. What are we going to do? Oh, we'll just start raising our rates. And before you know it, we're back in equilibrium. All right. Now, in the next section, the book is now making a distinction between the private sector and government in the loanable funds market. You'll recall that governments get involved in this market typically by borrowing money. They normally are demanders of loanable funds because they just always have deficits. It's just that simple. That's just reality. And when they have deficits, they have to get the money from somewhere, and that somewhere is to borrow it. Okay, so, but they're influenced not by interest rates or profits, but by the need to borrow to cover their deficits. As their deficits get bigger, they need to borrow more and more money. And so how does it affect this market? All right, well, so in this section, a distinction will be made between public or government demand for loanable funds and private demand for loanable funds. The total demand for loanable funds will therefore be the sum of these two types of demands. Now, like I said before, theoretically, a government can also be a supplier of loanable funds if it had a budget surplus. I think the last time we had a budget surplus in the US was in the 60s. So this is not likely to happen. So we can almost ignore this. The supply really is coming from households and corporations for the most part, although we can also obtain loanable funds from foreigners as well. Okay, for example, if foreign companies decide to buy American stocks and bonds or keep money in American banks, that type of thing, that all counts as loanable funds. All right, now imagine, here we go. Here's an actual budget surplus. So what they've decided to do here, the book is calling this PSLF, the public supply of loanable funds. And they're adding that to the private savings to come up with the total supply of loanable funds. So this now includes public saving plus private saving. So you have to imagine now that it includes both. And if there is in fact a budget surplus, there's actually more funds available to borrow, and that will drive down interest rates. And of course, that's the case we almost never see anymore, almost never. I don't know of any countries that where the government actually has surpluses. It just doesn't happen anymore. Now, on the other hand, what about a deficit? This is the more common case. A deficit means the government needs to borrow loanable funds, the same funds that the private sector wants to borrow. So this is the more normal case. Since the budget, there is no budget surplus. The supply is purely private supply. It's now the demand that includes both public and private sectors. So in other words, here this PDLF is the public demand for loanable funds, meaning the government. Which when added to the private demand gives us the total demand, which is higher than it otherwise would be. And so in other words, the budget deficit from the government pushes us from point 1 to 2. And with no change in the supply of loanable funds, that just drives up interest rates in the economy. So the deficit forces interest rates to go higher because the government is muscling into this market and borrowing up money that normally would be borrowed by either households or businesses. And this is what we normally see. So the government's deficits are just acting to increase the demand for loanable funds and thereby pushing up interest rates to levels that they otherwise would not have reached. So, yes, this is the impact of a government budget deficit. Interest rates are higher. Now, when interest rates are higher than they should have been, that makes it more costly for consumers to borrow. And it also reduces the amount of business borrowing so that businesses don't expand as quickly and fewer jobs are created. So this is actually a big deal. It's not just the rate, all rates going up, who cares? No, it has a direct impact on the ability of people to borrow and buy things like houses and cars, and for businesses to expand and create jobs. So it doesn't look like this is helping anybody, does it? No, and it isn't. All right, well, guess what? We're done with chapter 10 now. This went faster than I thought. So you know what that means? We have a golden opportunity here to dive into 11, which I really think you'll like a lot, because this is where we get to talk about the most exciting subject in the world, which is, of course, money. Okay, but we're going to approach it in a different way. You might think we're going to talk about the dollar bills in your wallet. Well, money is a much broader concept than that, as it turns out. And so we're going to see how money is formally defined by economists, what effect it has in the economy, and then along the way, we'll get an opportunity to learn about historical forms of money. And I think you'll find that to be extremely interesting. I mean, you could spend the whole semester just analyzing the types of money that have been issued in the United States. So we're going to have a lot of fun with this. And there's also some cool videos we're going to watch. But first, let's just grab chapter 11 and just start to get a feel for what this is all about. And before we do that, let me save this. All right, so let me go into my archives and open up chapter 11. Money. Yes, we're finally going to talk about money. How exciting is this? This is as cool as it's going to get. And you'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot of extremely interesting and surprising things. But first, let me save this. Hold on. Everybody's familiar, I suppose, with the money that we have now, but of course, American money has changed quite a bit over the centuries, as has been the case for every country in the world. So we want to start by asking ourselves the following question. What is money? All right, well, first of all, we're going to consider the role of money in the economy, the functions of the banking system, and finally, the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy. So it's almost like we saved the best for last. These are so important. And of course, every time you read the financial news, there's often a discussion about what the Fed is going to do. So we're going to start to understand what the Federal Reserve System is and how it operates and what it is attempting to accomplish. And again, it has its own very interesting history, which we'll go over. But we'll start out by asking a very important question. What is money? Now, if you went out and asked the average person that you meet in White Plains, let's say, what is money? What do you think money is? Tell me what you think. Most likely they'll answer the paper money in their wallet, the coins, and that's what most people think of as money. But it's actually a much broader idea than just that. And throughout history, many other forms of money have existed besides what we have now, paper money. So any asset or anything really that satisfies the following functions could be thought of as a form of money. It has to act as what's called a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. And if that's the case, then whatever it is can be thought of as a form of money. Now, you probably knew that in the past, gold and silver were used as forms of money. And in fact, they were used as forms of money for quite a few centuries. The use of paper money is actually a very recent development. So for many centuries, people used gold and silver. What happened? Why did that change? Well, we're going to find out. Okay, so first of all, let's look at these one at a time. Oh, Fernando, yes.
For the previous slide, I just wanted to ask, since I know this isn't there, but for what I thought, couldn't we also say that, like, money is like a way of like goods and services, pretty much, like
Well, we're going to
per.
find out right now. Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
all
No,
right,
that definitely falls into one of these categories. Yes. Here's what
all
it's
right.
for. Now, the word medium of exchange means that it must be something that is universally acceptable. In other words, when you go to a store, say, here, I've got paper money in my pocket, they will give you the merchandise in exchange for that paper money because it is what we call universally acceptable. Everybody in the United States knows that these pieces of paper in our wallets are a form of money, and they will give you whatever you need in exchange for those green pieces of paper. Now, why is that? Well, that's an interesting question of its own, but it says on the dollar bills somewhere that, and all of them, not just the ones, that these notes are legal tender for all debts, public and private, which means the government is saying you must use this as a form of money. In other words, you could go into a store and they might say, well, we don't really trust the US government. You have to give us gold. Well, that's not technically legal. They're required to accept US paper money and notes as a form of money. But nobody would ever question it, or very few people, because they know that if you pay them dollar bills, they can use those to buy something else or pay their other bills. So the dollar bills that we use are universally acceptable after many, many years of use, but also because the government legally enforces that. The medium of exchange needs to be easily standardized. So we're going to see what that means in a few minutes. But basically, this refers to a time when money was primarily in the form of gold and silver coins. Now, the thing about gold and silver is if there aren't any coins, people are spending um, gold ingots, they're called, and silver ingots, which means they're little pieces of silver or gold, which is fine. But if imagine yourself in the Middle Ages trying to buy something with a little tiny bar of gold, what they have to do to accept your gold bar is they have to weigh it, and they also have to test it for purity before they'll accept it. So the creation of coins made all of that completely unnecessary, because all of a sudden now every coin has a fixed amount of gold in it or silver. And that way it eliminates the need to test for the quality or the purity. And so it makes it much simpler to trade with other people when you have coins. So gold and silver were very useful as a form of money among many reasons, because it was easy to turn them into coins. And of course, with paper money, I mean, obviously every dollar bill in the US is the same. I mean, the serial numbers are different, but it's the same thing. And the coins are all the same. And so that makes it a lot easier for them to be accepted as a form of money. Now, this last piece is surprisingly important. It has to be divisible into smaller units so that change can be made. That has been a problem at different periods in our history. Let me show you a cool example of this. In the early colonial days, the United States had a severe shortage of metals to make coins of their own. The US at the time, nobody realized that gold and silver could be found on the the Western states, because we didn't have any Western states. And the English, because they were so upset with us, refused to sell us gold and silver. So what were we supposed to do about coins? Well, what we use is other coins, especially the Spanish silver dollar. Why? Because, well, even though it was a foreign coin, it still contained a lot of silver. So the colonists accepted Spanish silver dollars as a form of money. The problem with that, though, is that the Spanish silver dollars were quite expensive. They were worth a lot of money. And even with the Spanish silver dollar circulating, there still weren't nearly enough coins for the economy. And so they had, oh, by the way, here's a picture of what these things look like. They're very pretty coins, but they contain an awful lot of silver. And so, it's like, imagine if you're in your wallet, you only have $20 bills. You're going to need to get a lot of change. Now, there just weren't enough coins floating around to make change. So here's what they had to resort to. You go and take your Spanish silver dollar into a store, and you're trying to buy something that's only worth, let's say, a quarter of a silver dollar. They literally had to cut it up for you and give you back the other pieces. That's how desperate they were to make change. Well, there's no coins available. They're smaller than the Spanish silver dollar. So here's what we'll do. We'll make our own. And so the merchant had to cut it up into pieces for you and hand back the rest as your change. And these are actual examples of Spanish silver dollars that have been cut up into pieces. They're still, in various museums throughout the world. And so you can see that they could cut them up into pieces as small as 1/8. And so because they were cut up into 1/8 these pieces, the coins came to be known as pieces of 8. They were also known as reals. Okay, so when you hear about in any book about pirates, you hear about pieces of 8. They're talking about these Spanish silver dollars that have been cut up into 8 pieces. All right, so that's when you're desperate, when you need to cut up your change to make, or your coins to make more change. Now, these Spanish silver dollars continued to circulate throughout the United States until 1857, and then by then there was plenty of change in circulation, and the U.S. government announced that they would no longer be legal tender. That didn't mean you couldn't buy and sell them. It just meant that if you brought it to a store, they might refuse to accept it. Okay, so that's why smaller units is important. Now, by the way, we ran into the same problem during the Civil War. During the Civil War, all the metal that was available was used for the war effort. And suddenly there was a severe shortage of coins again. But the solution this time was very different. So I'm going to show you something which is going to surprise you to no end. I have to go find one. Like here's an example. This is it's a note, it's paper money, but look how much it's worth. It's only worth 50 cents. This is, as you can see, printed during the Civil War when we had a severe shortage of coinage. Some of these others, like this one, is only worth 25 cents. Look at that. And again, it would have been minted around that time. Actually, this is right after the Civil War, when there's still a shortage of coins. And if you go down the list, look at that. This one is worth 3 cents. That's how small they got. This is paper money, but it's only worth 3 cents. So that's how they decided to create change, I guess. Without the coins, they created paper money that was worth a fraction of a dollar. And the smallest one, like I said, was 3 cents. Now, of course, 3 cents in those days was probably worth about 20 cents now. So it's not a preposterously small amount of money, but still, this is something you don't expect to see. And the reasoning, again, was that all the metal that was being used for the war effort was not available to make coins. And at this time, I don't know if they discovered silver in Las Vegas yet. Las Vegas is one of the primary sources of silver in the United States. I don't know if that had been discovered yet at this time. Let me just see if I can find that out. In fact, Nevada might not have even been a state yet at this point in time. First, let's find out, when was Nevada added to the Union? Oh, all right. Well, there you go. It was just made it. But when was silver discovered in Nevada? Oh, 1859. All right. Well, maybe they hadn't found enough yet. Because I know the California gold rush was in 1849, but still, there simply wasn't enough to go around. And so the US government resorted to printing these fractional notes. And that carried on for a while into the 1870s. And then they gradually got rid of them. Yeah, that's one of the great things about the internet. I mean, normally you'd have to go to a museum to see all these wonderful examples of historical notes and coins. And in fact, if you really find this very exciting, you can find a lot of great examples of US notes and coins at the website of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. Sorry, San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, Museum of Money. Oh, that's the one at Kansas City. No, they have, oh God, I can't even find it now. Chicago has one of their own. Well, there it is. There it is. That's it. American Currency Exhibit. And if you look at the links, you can see all these wonderful notes and coins from throughout US history. It's a very long history, and there's so many exciting notes in here. Like the fractional notes we were just looking at would have been, yeah, here they are, Civil War fractional currency. Oh, there's plenty of them. But the common feature they have is that they're all worth a fraction of a dollar. Look at that. Man, 15 cents. Wow. Anyway, you know what I'm going to do here? Hold on. Because I'm so confident that you would enjoy this. I'm going to put this link in the chat room. Okay, so just remember, it's the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. If you're actually in San Francisco, I think you can actually still go in there and just look around. They have one in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Fed has one of these as well, if you're in that neighborhood. All right. So anyway, so that was divisible into smaller units. Classic example again being the Spanish silver dollars from the American colonial days when we simply didn't have enough coins in circulation. Then, oh, also two more characteristics that we need for a medium of exchange are it should be easy to carry and it should be durable. So that's another reason why gold and silver were so popular. Um, they wouldn't lose their value overnight. They would. I mean, what would have to happen for gold or silver to deteriorate? I don't even know. But now here's a fun example of money that is not easy to carry, and this type of money is used on an island in the South Pacific called Yap. So Yap is in a part of the Pacific Ocean. It's part of a chain of islands called Micronesia, and it's fairly close to Australia. And their form of money is these gigantic wheels made out of stone. And so the value of each of these is determined by its size. Now you can see these are not easy to carry. And in fact, they are never moved. If you were to look at pictures of Yap, you'd see that there are sections of the island where all these stone wheels are just sitting there and nobody ever moves them. So how can they use them as a form of money? Well, they have records. They keep track of which stone belongs to which individual. And whenever a trade or a sale is made, everybody updates their records. So there's no need to move the stones around. And they certainly aren't at risk of being stolen because first, they're too heavy. And secondly, even if they were stolen, it doesn't matter because everybody knows who the stones belong to. So this is the form of money used on Yap. And it has been for many centuries, although in the 80s, they finally announced that people could use the dollar too if they wanted to. But this is the main form of money on the island of Yap. And so it violates that rule about being easy to carry, but it doesn't seem to be a problem for the people on this island. It's a very small island, tiny little island, but it's one of the more fascinating forms of money that you'll ever see anywhere in the world. And if you're dying to see one, I think the Smithsonian in Washington actually owns one of these in their collection of world coins and notes. But yeah, I mean, really, that's kind of unusual. All right. What else does money need to do besides be durable and acceptable and universally standardized? Store of value refers to the idea that you can save it. It maintains purchasing power. It makes savings possible, and it provides what we call liquidity. That's the word we want to focus on right now. What in the world is liquidity? Well, liquidity. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Fernando.
I believe the liquidity is like the flow, like the regulation of like the money flow from like on high, like I guess like the transactions and all that stuff. I could be wrong, but
Well,
that's what I think.
the
Like
name is
it has to do with like the money flow, I think, right?
well, no, not really. I mean, the name is a little bit deceiving. Liquidity really means how easily can you use this asset to buy goods and services. So, like for example, obviously paper money is completely liquid. Nobody would say no to that. But there are other assets that you potentially could use to buy goods and services. And so we're going to take a look at a list of these, and we're going to see that not all assets have the same level of liquidity. So let me show you some quick examples. Currency, by which I mean paper money and notes, is obviously the most liquid asset of them all. There's no transaction you cannot make with cash. Now, checking deposits, even though we don't see checks used nearly as often as we used to, you can still pay for most things with a check. Like I said, you don't see it very often anymore, but it is still possible to pay for most things with a check. If you go to a supermarket, although they might not be happy about it, they still will take a check for your groceries. You just write it out, and here it is. Now, savings deposits are liquid too, in the sense that you can get your money back whenever you need it, but you can't bring your passbook into the supermarket and say, here, I've got all this money in my savings account. Can I use it to buy my groceries? For that, you still have to go through the trouble of withdrawing the cash from your savings account and then paying for your groceries with it. Now, of course, at this point in time, many supermarkets have banks in them anyway, so it's less of a problem. But so you would see that savings deposits are not quite as liquid as checking deposits, which in turn are not quite as liquid as currency, which is the most liquid of all assets. Now, in the middle, we have some assets that are liquid, but not quite as liquid, stocks and bonds, for example. What's the problem there? If I want to spend the value of my stock, I have to sell it. And that can take time and money. When you sell a stock, it's not a free transaction. There's usually a fee involved. And it can take a while to sell a share of stock. So if you need the money like immediately, this is not going to be as helpful as having currency or a checking deposit. Same thing with bonds. You can sell your bond and raise cash, but it does take a while, and there's a cost involved. So these two are not quite as liquid as the first categories of the first column. A certificate of deposit is a special type of savings account where you must leave your money there for a fixed length of time. So if you need the money back early, you're out of luck. So certificates of deposit are also not quite as liquid as the first column. And then we get to the really illiquid assets, the ones that really might have a lot of value, but it could take a long time to sell them. And even then, the value could be very uncertain, like real estate. Who knows what a piece of land is worth, or a building. Art, very much. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to go out and sell it. You have to put it up at auction, and then there has to be somebody who's interested in it, and they might offer you a much lower price than you're expecting. So art can take a long time to sell. And even precious stones like diamonds and rubies and emeralds, they have to be appraised, and it's not that quick to sell them. So this chart is meant to indicate different assets with different levels of liquidity. The idea here is that in order to be considered a form of money, that asset must be highly liquid. So that means we can rule these out. And we're going to see that for the most part, currency and checking deposits are considered to be a form of money. Sometimes so are savings deposits. Oh boy, sorry about that. All right, so, and then one more thing I want to show you. Oh, by the way, I just want to point out, why do people hold these highly illiquid assets if it's hard for us to spend them? Here's another important distinction between these. The highly liquid assets provide a very low rate of return. Really, you get no interest at all from holding paper money or coins. Your checking and savings deposits provide a very, very trivial rate of interest. Down here, though, these have a potentially very high rate of interest. And I guess I should say the same thing over here. So the returns are higher with the relatively illiquid assets, but then you lose that convenience of having liquidity. So what most people try to do is have some of both, like maybe keep a fair amount of money in your checking account, but also have stocks and bonds for your retirement portfolio, and not just try to have all or nothing. So in other words, you could have plenty of stocks and bonds, but if your mortgage is due tomorrow, that doesn't help you very much. You need to have some funds in your checking account or savings account for short-term debts, but with the understanding that you're going to get a very low rate of return. So, most people will try to have a mixture of all of these, depending on how much liquidity they need and what kind of rate of return they're trying to earn. All right, and then there was just that one last property that we want to quickly go over for money, which is unit of account. What does that mean? Well, that means all prices can be expressed in a common unit, which in our case means dollars. Okay. So in other words, without a unit of account, we can't have prices. What we have instead is what we would call exchange rates. For example, if imagine in a society like 1,000 years ago that doesn't have money, they instead everybody trades directly with each other for what they need. Well, that would be known as barter. Okay. And so imagine yourself being a wheat farmer and you want milk. Well, you're going to have to take your wheat over to the local dairy farmer and try to negotiate a trade, wheat for milk. And so you can imagine that's going to be very time consuming and awkward. So barter is when we have no money. Instead, we have to trade for everything directly. And so the existence of money makes that completely unnecessary because now all the goods that we produce in the economy can be measured in terms of prices, okay, dollars in our case. And that makes things so much smoother. So that's another good feature of a form of money. All right, now, so we've already taken a peek at this website, the history of U.S. currency, which is extremely interesting. We only have time to briefly talk about it, but I do have some interesting videos and presentations that we're going to look at to just get a snapshot of some historical forms of money that have been used in the United States and throughout the world, just to see how it was different than what we have now. So let's say, I guess we can stop right about here. We actually got more done than I even thought. So we'll just carry on. Now, remember, we agreed that your midterm number 2 could be handed in by a week from today because I forgot something got delayed. So therefore, I gave you extra time. And also, the first midterms should all be graded. If you don't see a grade there, let me know right away because that means I didn't receive your exam. It got lost somewhere in hyperspace. And so, get in touch with me and I'll have you send me your exam again so I can look at it. Otherwise, you should have a grade in the grade book in Moodle. Okay. So, all right. So I guess there's nothing else for us to do now except I think there might be some problem sets for chapter 10, but we can save those for next week. I think for now, this is fine. We will just keep going with this topic. And then maybe later in the week, we'll start looking at the problem sets from chapter 10. Okay. All right. How does that sound? So if there's
Sounds
no,
good, sir.
okay, if there's no last minute questions, I guess I'll just see you all next Tuesday. Hopefully better
Thank
weather.
you.
You're welcome. Fernando, yes.
Yeah, sir. Can I speak to you after class for a quick
Okay.
second?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what? Looks like not everybody wants to go home here. Is it confidential?
Are you talking to me, sir?
Yes.
No, I just wanted to just talk about real quick about like just like career wise, I guess, about the economics.
Okay. Actually, I have to really run because I have to go give an exam at another school, and the weather is so.
Oh, then it's fine.
Um,
Then not some other time then.
yeah, no, next time is fine. Normally, I
All
would
right,
be fine with it, but I really am concerned about the weather, and I want to get an early start. So why don't we do this next Tuesday then?
for sure,
Okay,
Professor.
good.
Have a good
All right.
weekend.
All right. See you next time.
All right, thank you for class.
Okay. Bye.